Right, so I think I'm going to do like this for just the attention of the public. So let me just introduce our last speaker today, Sarah Chan. That she's a Chancellor's Fellow. No, right, okay, that's me then. All right. So our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Chan, Chancellor's Fellow at the Asher Institute for Population Health Science and Informatics and Deputy Director of the Mason Institute for Medicine, Life Science and Law at the University of Edinburgh. She has an extensive academic career on the ethics of new biomedical technologies, reproductive medicine, gene therapy, and genetic modification, and published several papers, actually some of them specifically on CRISPR as a tool for editing human embryos. So it's a pleasure having you here today, but not only for your career, but also for your connections with Spain. So we hear that you're working and collaborating with the Observatory of Bioethics and Law at the Universities of Barcelona and Basque Country, and the Center for Law and Human Genome at the University of Deusto. So thank you very much for coming today.
And thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and what a fantastic day of talks we've had so far. Okay, can everybody still hear me? Yes. Great. All right, we're going to change tack a little bit. We have heard about the basic science of CRISPR, and we've heard about some of the very exciting applications in animals and in stem cells. I'm going to talk about human genome editing. But I'm not going to talk about the science. I'm going to talk about some of the ethical issues implicated in the idea that we might use these technologies not just to edit cells, not just to edit cows and pigs, but to edit ourselves and our children. What I hope to convince you of is that this is an idea that we should be open to. It's an idea that we need to consider, but it's not something that we should hear and run away from. So although the idea of human genetic modification is something that fills people with concern, I think it's an idea we need to think about seriously. Sorry? Okay. Right, to give you a quick rundown of how this field has developed, it was in April 2015, so nearly about a year ago now, that the first report of the use of gene editing in human embryos came out. And in response to this, scientists two different groups of scientists demanded a moratorium on human gene editing. In response to this, scientists, ethicists and policymakers mobilised. In September to December of that year, we had first the meeting of the Hingston Group and their statement on human germline genome editing, and then the meeting of the combined National Academies of Science and Medicine, the UK Academy of Medical Sciences and the Chinese Academies of Science were also involved in this in December in 2015 in Washington. In February of last year, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority that regulates all research and uses of human embryos in the UK granted the first licence for embryo gene editing research. In April, a second study came out from China, this time reporting the editing of a gene for HIV susceptibility in human embryos. Our Nuffield Council on Bioethics released its first report on genome editing in September last year. They are now convening 2 further working groups on human uses and on plant and animal applications. Getting more recent, November last year, the first report of the somatic use of CRISPR in clinical trials for lung cancer. And then in February this year, the report from the Washington meeting finally came out. So this is a saga that's been unfolding over the last couple of years. But in fact, ethically speaking, it goes back a long way further than that, because genetic modification and human germline genetic modification is something we've been talking about for a long time. In fiction, in science, in ethics, we've been thinking about the concept of genetic modification. And as this new debate over the use of CRISPR to gene edit human embryos has unfolded, we're seeing a lot of the same arguments come up. So, for example, we have the argument from repugnance, the so-called yuck factor, where people say, well, it's just wrong, I just don't like it. We have the argument from unnaturalness, and those of you who work with gene editing and sometimes talk about your work might hear some of these when people are expressing discomfort with the idea. People say, well, it's not natural to muck around with genes, or they might say tampering with nature is wrong, or they might say it's dangerous. Now that's actually a risk-based argument rather than a sort of naturalness argument. Or there's the argument that boils down to what I call saying that it's an improper use of agency, more commonly known as playing God. So this argument focuses on it's something that we oughtn't to be doing. Fair enough, mutation happens, but we shouldn't be deliberately doing it. It's something that should be out with our control, something that we shouldn't attempt to exercise agency over. And you'll often hear words like hubris and humility thrown around, that who are we to decide that we can play God with DNA? Okay, these arguments are old and so are the responses. As far as the yuck factor argument, we might say, well, repugnance is not enough proof that something is morally wrong. My example is that I happen to find these fruity yellow objects rather repugnant. Don't like bananas, but that doesn't mean there's anything morally wrong with them. More seriously, we might look to the taboos of previous eras. There used to be repugnance expressed about the idea of homosexuality. There used to be repugnance expressed about the idea of miscegenation. But I hope that we don't think that either of those acts is actually morally wrong. In effect, the argument from repugnance boils down to saying, well, I just don't like it. But does that mean that nobody can do it, that nobody else should be allowed to do it? I don't like bananas, but you can eat all the bananas you want. So the argument from repugnance doesn't really hold much moral weight when it comes to saying what we should or shouldn't do. As far as the argument from naturalness, I think it should be pretty obvious that nature is not a moral force. As has been pointed out, the genomes that exist today, whether in humans or in other organisms, are just products of random mutation or evolution. So to say it's unnatural, well, that might mean it's less than random, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's better to make a choice rather than to roll the dice. And as far as saying it's an improper exercise of agency, to say that we oughtn't to play God, I think that ought to prompt us to say, well, what are the limits of proper agency, and what's so good about being humble? If I go to the hospital and I have some terrible disease and my doctor has in her hands the medicine that can cure me, but says, I am too humble, it would be playing God to attempt to save your life, I'm not going to do anything, I think I might be justifiably aggrieved. I might say, well, this is what you have the tools, why not do it? So why does using gene editing in potentially beneficial ways constitute any more of an improper exercise of agency than using the other tools that are available to us? Okay, so those are some of the old arguments, old responses. Here's another argument that I'm sure you'll have heard. In fact, it's even in the title of our event today, I think. So the argument about designer babies and slippery slopes, otherwise known as, well, where will it stop? So the argument here is that allowing germline modification of humans is the first step on the slippery slope that will lead us to designer babies and to genetic enhancement. This fear was raised particularly by one of the groups of scientists who implored, don't edit the human germline. So this was, remember, in response not to attempts to create a genetically modified baby. This was, in fact, in response to experiments on human tripronuclear embryos. So tripronuclear meaning they have 3 pronuclei. They are never going to be capable of developing into a human. So this was experiments just on embryos, but nevertheless, scientists said, don't do it. Many oppose germline modification because permitting even unambiguously therapeutic interventions could start us down a path, there's the slippery slope argument, towards non-therapeutic genetic enhancement. And then they said, we share these concerns. Okay, so slippery slopes, genetic enhancement, designer babies, what's this argument actually about? I'm going to throw in 2 words here. One is instrumentalization, and I will come to that in a bit. But essentially, what are we concerned about when we talk about a designer baby? We're not thinking about the parents who desperately want to have a healthy child and will go to any lengths to ensure it, are we? We're talking about parents going to the baby supermarket, filling out the order form, ticking, I want this, that, and the other, hold the onions, please. So that's our concern, and that's Not so much because it's bad to have a baby hold the onions, it's bad because of what we are doing to the whole process of having children, the whole process of reproduction. And I'm going to say it's because we're worried about instrumentalization, and I'll explain what I mean by that later. The other word that's big in there is this idea about enhancement. And I will come back to that again towards the end of the talk, because I think it raises some questions about if we're going to pursue this technology, what the limits should be. And I will give you a sneak preview, given that my last section of the talk is called Where Do We Draw the Line? Maybe this concept of enhancement and how far down the line we go before its enhancement might become important. Okay. But let's ask ourselves, what's actually wrong with human germline genetic modification? So what's wrong about editing the human embryo? This is, remember, the stage at which the research is at. We're just talking about editing embryos here. What's wrong with human germline genetic modification? Okay, well, you'll often hear two arguments when it comes to why germline genetic modification might be a problem. One is that it affects the genome of future generations. The other is that it amounts to doing things to or making genetic choices for those who are unable to choose for themselves. And we might further divide those out into embryos, so we're making choices about embryos, or we're making choices about future people. Indeed, we might be worried that the embryos are going to turn into future people. When we look at the argument this way, well, why are we bothered about doing things that are going to affect future people in the genetic sense? That also is going to affect the genome of future generations. Why is this a concern? Well, some people might say the genome of future generations is our concern because it affects the genome of humanity. It affects something that is shared by us all, something that's our common heritage. But we might also say that affecting the genome of future generations is a concern because it's going to affect more people. It's going to make any problems worse. So if you make a change and it's only present in that one person, well, if it's good, that's great. If it's bad, that's unfortunate, but the consequences will end with that one person. Whereas when we talk about germline modification, we're talking about making a heritable change. We're talking about something that's going to be passed down to future generations. So that means that if something goes wrong, then the adverse effects will be worse because more people will be affected. And as well, if we think that this making genetic choices for people who can't choose for themselves is bad, then there's going to be even more people who haven't had that choice. Not just your child, but all of their children will have been deprived of that choice. So I'm going to say the real concerns about heritable germline modification come down to this point about genetic choices, this point about adverse effects and risks. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong button here, I don't know why. Oh, it's that one. Yeah, adverse effects and risks. And then this kind of vaguely worded, but somehow it's an idea that people seem very drawn to, this idea that the common heritage of humanity or the genome of humanity is something that we should be concerned about. Okay, so I will come back to these 3 points about choice, about risk of adverse effects, and about the genome of humanity shortly. But I want us just to say, well, let's take stock. Where are we right now? In terms of the research that's being done, the research that's being proposed, we're talking mainly about, in fact, we're talking entirely about research on embryos. We are not performing interventions on future people. We are not letting the embryos that we're performing these procedures on turn into future people. That means that we're not affecting any of the genome of future generations, future people's choices, future people's welfare. We're not actually affecting any of those when all we do is research on embryos. And so I guess my first take-home point from today in relation to genome editing research on embryos, we need to think what we mean by this term germline. Technically, yes. When you edit any cell that's part of the germ cell lineage, you are editing the germline, and that includes germ cells, gametes, the pluripotent cells of the embryo, and so forth. But we know that today, given that we can derive pluripotent stem cells from somatic cells and gametes from pluripotent cells, theoretically any modification could result in a genetically modified germline. So what we're really concerned about, I think, is not the modification of the germline in a scientific sense. We're concerned about the creation of future genetically modified people and the possibility that they will have inherited genetic modifications. So it's not really embryos that we're worried about at all. Now, this is not to say that the human embryo is not still a subject of moral concern. There are people who think that we ought not to be doing any form of research on embryos at all. Given that in this country we do permit research on embryos, I think that's a debate that we've had. I don't think that purely on the possibility of gene editing, we are going to revisit that. If you accept research on embryos, there ought to be no reason not to accept gene editing research on embryos, as long as those embryos don't turn into people. And I think there's a simple regulatory solution to this. We have it already here in the UK. If what we're concerned to prevent is reproductive use of gene editing, in other words, the creation of genetically modified future people with heritable gene edits, then what we should prohibit is reproductive use and not research. I will point out that this has proven to be effective in the case of cloning research. So we talked about Dolly the sheep. We have not had Dolly the human yet, and we're very unlikely to, despite the fact that in the UK we allow somatic cell nuclear transfer for research purposes. Our law very effectively prohibits reproductive cloning, and I think we can do the same with gene editing. Okay, so we should sleep tight at night, feeling safe that no genetically modified babies are going to be produced in the UK anytime soon. But let's go on and say, well, what if we did? What if we did cross that line where we're letting embryos turn into future people, where we are exploring this whole new territory on this side of the map of what might a future be like when we have the potential to create genetically modified human beings. And I'm going to deal with these issues of choice, of risk, and the genome of humanity in turn. Okay, so should we be making these sorts of choices for our children? What if something goes wrong? We know at the moment that there are various possibilities of, say, off-target effects with the use of gene editing that might cause unexpected consequences. We don't know what all of the consequences will be when we perform gene editing. So, should we make that choice if something might go wrong? Okay, we can look at these issues of risk and choice in the following way. The argument against using gene editing for children on the basis of the right to choose is to say, well, our children, or the future people they will become and their descendants, have the right to an unmodified genome. So they don't have the capacity to consent to this procedure. They don't have the capacity to make choices about their genes. So do we have the right to make those choices for them? As far as the risks are concerned, the argument is that, look, if something goes wrong, it's with us forever, it's heritable. Not just your children, but your children's children and their children are all going to have it. So the risk is going to have a longer lasting, wider reaching effect because it's heritable. Okay, how should we think about these arguments? I think it's fairly obvious that children never have any choice about the genes they are born with. And choosing not to do gene editing would still be a choice on our parts. In other words, once the technology is there, we have a choice to use it or a choice not to use it. What we can't do is abdicate that entirely. Either way, whether we decide to do it or to not do it, we've still made a choice. That being the case, since we have to choose either way, in other words, they can never choose and we must always choose, why wouldn't we make the choice that results in curing disease? If you have to make a choice, why not make a choice that's better for your child? Thinking then about the possibility of adverse consequences and risks, well, if the result is beneficial, if you can fix this mutation not just for your children but their children, and so on and so forth, why wouldn't you want to do that? Why say I'm going to apply a temporary one-generation patch rather than something that can fix the problem for good? If an unexpected harm did occur, it need not be passed on to future generations. So, okay, we hope that it's going to go well and that your family forevermore is cured of this mutation. Perhaps something will go wrong, But if it does, that harm need not be passed on. It's a difficult choice to make, to have to say, well, I have now been given an inheritable mutation by the gene editing procedure, but the choice is whether or not to pass that on. And people can make that choice by choosing not to reproduce. So in other words, if you perform gene editing hoping that it will have a good outcome for your children, something goes wrong, it has a bad outcome instead, they don't have to pass that on to future generations. They could choose not to have children. And of course, that's a very difficult choice to have to make. But remember, it's a choice that people already face when they are carriers or sufferers of genetic disease. In other words, the choice that we are saying could be open here, if something goes wrong, you can choose not to have children, is no worse than the choice of saying, we don't have the tools to fix this, but you can choose not to have children. So I don't think that the arguments from risk and choice put in this way provide a convincing reason to say we shouldn't modify the genes of future generations. It's interesting, though, to think about what patients would choose. Last year, Nature published this story about Ruthie. Ruthie's a little girl who suffers from a genetic disorder. That means she is blind and has a number of other difficulties, but nevertheless she plays basketball, has a full and happy life, and she wouldn't want to be any different. So her dad asked her, if we had had gene editing back when you were conceived, would you have liked us to fix you? Would you have liked us to correct this gene? Ruthie didn't hesitate before answering no. So she wouldn't want to have been changed. Her father goes on to say, it might have erased some of the things that make Ruthie special. Her determination, for instance, had they chosen to edit the gene that caused her blindness. Okay, so I've said that that children cannot choose the genes that they're born with, and I've said that we as parents perhaps should make good choices for them. But now we have a patient saying, if my parents had been able to choose, I wouldn't have wanted them to choose that for me. What does this mean then for the choices that we might be faced with when deciding whether or not to use gene editing in a situation like this, where, for example, we're going to have a child and we think they might suffer from blindness, but we think about Ruthie and we think, she didn't want to be fixed. Should I fix my child? Okay, so the argument that one might distill from this is to say, well, here's a patient saying she wouldn't want to have been edited. So that must mean it would be wrong to make that choice for her. Let's think about that for a moment, though, and reverse the situation. Let's imagine a parallel universe in which gene editing was invented many years before. And let's imagine that in that universe, a girl's parents did decide to edit the gene that was going to make her blind so that she ended up fully sighted. Would this patient who had been edited say, you shouldn't have done that, I wish you hadn't. I wish I hadn't been edited. I wish I were blind instead. I don't think that's very likely. And so here what we have is a form of what we might call status quo bias. We like things to be the way they are. In a universe where editing is possible, people wouldn't say, I wish you hadn't done it. In a universe where Ruthie wasn't gene edited, of course she's not going to say, I wish I had been. The other argument, based on what her father said, is one that comes up quite often in relation to selection or to genetic therapies for various diseases. And that's the one saying, well, the benefits of these conditions would be lost if we edited them out. So remember Ruthie's father saying it might have changed some of what makes her special. Think about people saying it would have made our lives worse. We would have come together less as a family. We would have understood compassion and caring less. There are all sorts of benefits that people bring up to say, well, if we didn't have this child, we wouldn't have those benefits. So the argument is the benefits of these conditions would be lost if we edited those conditions out. Is that a reason not to do it? Well, let's do the reversal test again. If the benefits conferred by having a child with this condition are a reason not to perform gene editing, would we or should we choose to edit in such a condition in order to produce those benefits? Would we as parents say, I'm going to edit my child's genes so that she ends up blind because just think how determined and strong she's going to be? Would we judge them good parents if they decided to do that? I very much doubt it. And so I think these arguments about what patients would choose or what this particular patient would choose don't necessarily hold water as to how we should choose when we have that choice. So taking that back then to these arguments about risk and the idea that I touched on earlier of playing God, I want to ask whether our ideas about when we should or shouldn't use editing in view of the potential risks, in view of what people might have wanted for themselves, in view of the benefits we might end up foregoing, whether these concerns about risk are really about agency and responsibility for outcomes. So let me explain that a little bit. When we say something might go wrong, we don't know what will happen, I don't want to do it because if I do it, then I will have harmed my child in some way. Are our intuitions about risk and what you're responsible for actually based on this idea that we're more responsible for something when we do than for something when we fail to do, the so-called acts omissions distinction? So in other words, if I choose to pursue gene editing because I think it will benefit my child, but a harm results instead, am I somehow more morally responsible than if I say I'll do nothing and my child ends up with a harmful condition? Is it less worse for a child to suffer because we do nothing than because we do something? That might seem intuitively plausible, that we're more responsible for what we do than what we fail to do, but I think we need to also think about the opportunity costs involved when we choose not to do. In many cases, the benefits may outweigh the harms, and refusing to act may result in greater harm. So imagine a case where we're not talking about gene editing, we are talking about taking your child to the emergency department after an accident at home. Now you might think, I've got two courses of action here. I can go to the hospital or I can not go to the hospital. But suppose if I set out to go to the hospital in my car, we're in a car accident and my child winds up much worse harmed than if I hadn't done that. Well, clearly that means I ought to just stay at home and not do anything, because although my child is suffering from a harm now, if I do something and harm results, then I'm more responsible. So don't go to the emergency department, leave your child at home. That to me doesn't make any sense. And I think that is, when you dissect it, I think that's the kind of attitude that is being applied when it comes to risk of harm and the use of new technologies. Okay, let's go on to this argument about human dignity and the genome of humanity, sometimes phrased as, isn't there something special about the human genome? Okay, so the argument from the sanctity of the genome goes something like this. There's something special, there's something sacred about the human genome. That means there is an inherent moral proscription against modifying it. In early drafts of the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics and the Human Genome was referred to as the common heritage of humanity. And although that wording was deleted from the final version, this idea that there's something shared, special, and sacred in the genome seems to have persisted. A variation of this argument is often seen in the form of modifying the genome being a violation of human dignity. So again, we can look at these arguments in various ways. We might ask, what is it about the human genome in exactly its current state that confers dignity? The genome that we happen to have as Homo sapiens sapiens today has already been modified through evolution. It's a genome that we shared with our forebears, it's a genome that we shared with our descendants, but it's always changing. So there's nothing special about the genome in exactly its current state today. Changes to the genome occur naturally as a result of mutations. Some of those can be beneficial, and presumably without any inherent effect on dignity. As we sit here, in millions of your cells, mutations are occurring every second. but I don't think we feel that there is some inherent effect on dignity that is being brought about by that process. So this idea of the human genome as something special and sacred is a little bit problematic. As the National Academy's report put it, there is no single human genome shared by all of humanity. It bears noting that this argument about dignity and the sanctity of the genome is usually raised in relation just to germline genetic modification. So no one seriously claims, I don't think, that modifying the DNA of somatic cells is an affront to human dignity. It's germline genetic modification that we're talking about. And so we're not talking about individual single human genomes, but something more amorphous, something we might refer to as the collective genome of humanity. Okay, so how do we evaluate this argument that genetic modification is wrong because it will affect the genome of humanity? By which we mean, I guess, the human gene pool of the present and future. Again, if we look at the genome as a biological object, this doesn't really make sense. We already make choices that affect the future human gene pool when we choose when, with whom, and even whether we're going to reproduce. Think about it. If we decide to have children or not to have children, deciding when to have children, with whom to have children, all of those are going to affect what genes are present in the next generation. And those choices, those decisions are going to have consequences for the next generation and so on and so forth. In other words, we are making decisions that affect the genome of humanity today. We might suggest facetiously that if what we value is the genome of humanity in its exact present state today as it exists in the cells of all of us, the only way to do that would be through universal reproductive cloning. And even that wouldn't ensure that there were no change because of the possibility of somatic mutations. So I think all of this leaves us asking then, what exactly is sacred, if anything, about the collective human genome? It is, after all, just a collection of bases, a concatenation of chemicals. What could be sacred about that? I think that this concern about the genome of humanity is poorly phrased. I think it's what I'm going to say is a moral myth. When we say the human genome, most of you are scientists. What immediately springs to mind for you is probably some variation of the Human Genome Project, or 46 chromosomes, or the various genome sequencing projects that have attempted to define the human genome. Not a sacred object, a biological object. And I think people who say that changing the genome of humanity will somehow infringe human dignity are speaking a different language. They're not really speaking a scientific language, they're speaking a political one. We talk about the common heritage of humanity. Well, I've been doing some thinking lately about genome editing in non-humans. We've heard that there are all sorts of exciting genome editing projects happening in various animals. I was thinking about genome editing for dogs, and it struck me that nobody ever worries about the genome of doggity. Nor do we worry about the genome of piggity or the genome of cowity. We only worry about the genome of humanity, and that I think suggests that we're not really worried about the genome in the sense of genetics, in the sense of biology at all. What we're concerned about, and here comes back that word that I brought up earlier, it's a concern about instrumentalization. We worry about genetically engineering humans in a way that we don't worry about engineering dogs, cows, or pigs, because we're worried that we are being instrumental. We're thinking that we shouldn't treat other humans like dogs. And this is where the designer babies argument comes in. We're worried that when you can choose your children's genes in the same way you might choose a German Shepherd or a Dalmatian, we are treating humans instrumentally, and that's something that we oughtn't to do. But I submit that this idea that choosing genes and making choices about your children's genes is necessarily instrumentalizing somehow represents a false dichotomy between nature and culture. We might say that we have already engineered dogs, cows, and pigs. In fact, one of the commonest claims for the acceptability of animal gene editing is to say it's what we already do. by selection. It's just more efficient, more precise, allows us to introduce yellow stripes or other variation that we want. We already do it, but this is just a better way of doing it. But we don't do that to humans. Yes, we have done that to dogs. We have, as I call it, built the dog. Dogs, laboratory mice, and farm animals are all products of enculturation. They are already instrumentalized by humans. But what we need to consider is that while we have been building the dog, while we've been domesticating them and selecting for the breeds that we want, they have also built us, in a sense. Paleoanthropologists say that the effects of domesticating dogs have had an effect on the human gene pool. The effect of agriculture, the mass cultivation of crops, the provision of different food sources in ways that we used not to have. All of these have changed the gene pool. In other words, we have built ourselves. And we're going to continue to do so. So gene editing is not that step over the line to instrumentalization. It's another form of building ourselves to the lives that we want to have and the ways that we want to be. So I want to suggest that actually not all uses of human germline genetic modification are wrongful instrumentalization. Okay, so where does that all leave us? Let me end with a couple of thoughts about regulation. I've so far presented arguments that I hope have at least prompted you to think about human germline genome editing and whether it might not be the terrible thing that some people suggest it is. I hope that these arguments have left you at least a little more open to the idea. When I talk to people about this, a common response that I get is, yes, but where do we draw the line? So, they're kind of convinced by the idea that, well, if we can do something good, then it's worth doing. They're convinced by the arguments about children don't have a choice, so let's make a good choice for them. But they say, well, yes, but where do we draw the line? And this, I always think this is an interesting question because it kind of implies that a line has to be drawn somewhere, which, I'm not sure a line always has to be drawn. But let's say, for the moment, where do we draw the line? And I want to address this question by returning to the other concept I flagged earlier, that question about enhancement. Because this is a place where people are now suggesting in policy that here is where the line ought to be drawn. We're going to allow uses of genome editing, provided they're safe enough, provided they're tested, provided they're well regulated, up to a point, but after that, no more. The report of the National Academies suggested that genome editing in humans for reproductive purposes might be acceptable for serious diseases, but they highlighted the need for reliable oversight mechanisms to prevent extension to uses other than preventing a serious disease. And they went on to say, if you can't do that, if you can't ensure that it won't be extended to other uses, the committee's view is that germline genome editing would not be permissible. And they were thinking specifically of genetic enhancement, to which they devoted an entire chapter of the report. Now, this brings up all sorts of questions about which I could give an entirely different talk around human enhancement and what constitutes enhancement anyway. You've probably heard it pointed out that we humans in the 21st century here in Scotland are already enhanced compared to humans in other times and places. There are many other arguments to suggest that it's not going to be so simple to draw a line between treatment for serious disease and enhancement. But even that aside, I think it's interesting to note that the NAS report didn't say that enhancement was necessarily wrong. So they didn't say treatment's acceptable, but enhancement's not. What they said is, well, we think there needs to be a lot more robust public discussion about enhancement before we are willing to contemplate going there. Now, what I want to point out, my aim here is not to make a case for human enhancement, although I think there could be one to be made. But my aim is to say, what kind of claim is this? This is actually not a claim about what's morally acceptable, but about where a regulatory balance should be struck. And what the report amounts to saying is that where something, in this case therapeutic germline genetic editing, is acceptable, but where a second option, in this case enhancement, we're not sure about enhancement, then if we can't ensure not B, we ought to ban A. Did everybody follow that? So if we can't ensure that we won't go down the enhancement route, you can't even have therapeutic editing. And I really want to ask whether that's the right place to strike the balance. I think we need to really think about both both the risks but also the benefits that we would be giving up if we said, I'm sorry, someone might enhance themselves, you can't have treatment. Is that the right place to strike the balance? I think our regulatory approach to gene editing in the very near future is going to have to reconsider the notion of risk and benefit. At the moment, the scientific and policymaker consensus is clinical reproductive applications premature because it's too dangerous or it's uncertain. But I wonder if we're overstating the physical risks here to mask an ongoing uncertainty about the moral risk. Bruce, in his talk, asked, can we afford to make mistakes with humans? And I want to say, well, given some of the conditions that we're suggesting gene editing might treat, can we afford not to? What's the counterbalance? What are we giving up if we say, for fear of making a mistake, we can't afford to try and do this treatment? And if you consider the balance for some very severe conditions, for example, epidermolysis bullosa is a condition, it's a skin adhesion condition, and basically if you have it, all of your skin falls off. It's a really horrible disease, causes terrible suffering, could be cured by somatic gene editing. I've seen a fantastic talk where they did gene editing of skin stem cells and regrew an entire epithelium. But that boy still had months of pain while his skin fell off and was then replaced. What if we could fix that before birth? Okay, so against that, look, here are some of the terrible things that we can prevent if we use this. What's the mistake that we can't afford to make? Who might be harmed if we allow this technique, and how? Okay, we have these worries about instrumentalization, but does that vague fear about enhancement and instrumentalization justify foregoing the benefits? How do we decide where to draw the line? Well, I would say we can't regulate whether people are acting instrumentally. We can only regulate what acts are allowed. So in other words, we can't say you can use genome editing if it's for your child's good, but you can't use it if what you're trying to do is go to the baby supermarket. You can't regulate intent like that. So what we need is an on-balance test of moral permissibility. Let me give you two examples: in vitro fertilization and paying for organ donation. Now, these are both potentially instrumentalizing. IVF could be used to go to the baby supermarket. Paid organ donation could be used to give people money until they're coerced into handing over their organs. But there are also possible good motives for both. The desire to bring a child into the world and raise a family. You can imagine a situation in which someone who'd received an organ donated altruistically was so grateful that they wanted somehow to reward their donor. So there could be good motives and instrumental motives in each case. But what we've decided is that on balance, it's more likely IVF will be put to good use, and it's more likely paying for organs will be instrumentalizing, and that's how we've regulated. So what are people likely to do with genome editing? I would say that given IVF, given PGD, I think on balance, probably it's going to be okay. It's going to be more like IVF than paying for organs. Does this suggest we should draw a permissive line? Well, let me leave you with this final thought. Is regulation about drawing the line for science? Or is it more about promoting public participation, discourse, and trust, rather than what we should ban and what we should allow? And that's it. Thank you very much.